Of all the things he is criticized for, this is the worst failure without any doubt whatsoever. I'm not even trying to justify his faults here. I'm just offering alternative perspectives to view them as opposed to going right ahead and blaming him for all that went wrong in the crazy decade he presided. But while all the other subjects can be rationalized somewhat easily, this appeared to be an impossible task. Make no mistake, the Iraq War has led to Iraqi deaths of from 100,000 by combat to 1 million by collateral repercussions, an additional 4,000 American soldiers, an estimated $2 trillion wasted, further inspiring the rise of ISIS and the destruction of many parts of the country. I am also aware of this.
Those weapons of mass destruction gotta be somewhere.
And this.
Mr. Bush, when are you going to apologize for the million Iraqis that are dead because you lied? You lied about weapons of mass destruction. You lied about connections to 9/11. You lied about Iraq being a threat. You sent me to Iraq.
And this.
Okay. Sir, this is not the time. This is not the time for that, sir. Yes. No.
By every point, the country should have never gone. Now, why did this happen? Well, after 9/11, Bush launched the global war on terror, which involved invading Afghanistan and upgrading national security. However, Iraq had nothing to do with the tragedy, so how could this be involved? The thing is, he has had a gripe against it and its leader Saddam Hussein for quite some time now. He threatened his father at one point, and one could argue he wanted to supposedly finish what he started. HW is who I like to call the president of short wars. Manuel Noriega was dictating the country of Panama before senior sent troops in to liberate it from his rule. Even though most of its people were grateful, he still made it a mental note to not get too involved with other countries' affairs. When Saddam attacked Kuwait in 1990, he started another months-long war, and upon finishing, he left right afterwards, to which his son would not follow his lead. Unfortunately, he probably should not have followed his principles, as it would ironically lead to much greater destruction, little did we know. Let me just say that I actually quite like HW overall. In fact, I had actually seen him in person once at a baseball game. Not only that, but he had a dog named Millie. A dog named Millie. I really wanted to understand W's decision, as not only is the idea that someone who waged an unjustified war being hardly touched by the consequences unsettling, but I have many reasons to like the guy. First off, his father, as I've mentioned, I have a warm spot for. He's from Texas. He ruled during my childhood, which gives a nostalgic factor, and most of all, he's really a nice guy. When I started researching him and first heard the idea that he was a war criminal, it began to baffle me how Trump could be seen as significantly worse than him, aside from personality. Is he worse in terms of character? Oh yeah, undeniably. But in terms of total damage caused, I truly found it hard to make the case that he overpowered Bush. The worst things I know of him doing include the bargaining with Ukraine for dirt on Biden, the Child Separation Act, the Capitol storm, and his mishandling of the pandemic. The first of which is certainly a great scandal, but not on the scale of destroying a country. The immigration policies were again bad, but on a much smaller scope. The Capitol storm was flat out overblown and milked like a post-Armageddon cow. And the pandemic is the only thing that can even combat starting wars. But again, that only proves his lack of character. It's not illegal to be indifferent, and I doubt his leadership alone during that time would have saved the 400,000 Americans. You can only argue in good faith that Trump was a worse president to the extent that he would have handled Bush's situation much worse, which I suppose I can see, although he was surprisingly anti-war, so you'll have to be a bit more creative there. But if you make the argument and start out by saying he's worse by far and barely even touch Iraq, your opinion is meaningless. I'm just stating the facts. If your argument doesn't start with, let me explain, and you don't see how Bush can be considered worse, there is no way you're older or any smarter than some ditzy blue hair who hasn't lived through the wars. From a near objective standpoint, if you're going to blame Bush for the two wars and the financial crisis of 2008, you don't have any reason to hate Trump more unless you're a crazy conspiracy theorist who thinks he's going to resurrect Adolf Hitler from the dead. I really do not want to use this term, but that is an actual verifiable case of Trump derangement syndrome, which I have just recently learned actually originated from Bush. Now, the reason I bring this up is that I wonder if Bush's character has contributed to the optimistic perception of him with the public, including me after the events of his presidency. But what are my thoughts on his judgment? Well, the pretext he gave for invading Iraq included the claim of weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear, which would turn out to be false, and afterwards it evolved to spreading democracy and toppling Saddam Hussein. Personally, I can't imagine this was an oil war. During my research, I began to realize how scarce the subject has even been included. And if America wanted oil, they could have invaded Saudi Arabia as they had more of it. It would have been easier, and the 9/11 hijackers were actually Saudi, so the justification would have been smoother. Also, it wasn't as if there was no evidence of weapons of mass destruction with the intelligence before the invasion. There were suspicious warehouses set around. Saddam Hussein himself actually thought he had weapons of mass destruction, and also boasted about it to the world. He proved to have chemical weapons given the Halabja massacre of 1988. Iraq was certainly an unstable country that violated UN resolutions before and ruled with fear over its citizens, so one can understand his belief that going in would end well. He most likely looked at his father's legacy of organizing clean-cut wars that had minimal damage and resolved the threat, though overlooking the vast amount of political experience he had compared to his 5 years of governing Texas. Ultimately, he went in with hardly a plan despite mass protests unlike with Afghanistan, and while it looked promising at first, a civil war between the Sunnis and Shiites broke out, and if it brings any comfort, most of the deaths in the Iraq War were caused by this, as opposed to American troops targeting civilians. Ultimately, I believe the evidence points to spreading democracy or heroism as his main motive with this. I think he believed, or at least hoped, to find the weapons and wasn't expecting the discovery, so limited to mere leftovers from previous use. With regards to responsibility, note that Democrats, Congress, his Vice President Dick Cheney, and Tony Blair were in on this as well. Even Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden voted for it, and even to this day, he doesn't condemn him for it. He even gave him a medal. This only begs the question, is this to imply that he would have started the Iraq War in his shoes? To that end, is he not just as dangerous as he is? To those who think so, let me say, if you think your government is corrupt enough to start a war on unjustified pretexts, don't wait until the day actually comes to combat them. Go ahead and demand the system for change now and prove the doubters wrong before it's too late. To be honest, I can actually understand why Bush is confident in his decision, as it's hard to look at the situation you've led to and not go through serious mental gymnastics to escape the devastating guilt. But Biden is a Democrat who hasn't had that incentive. It truly confuses me, and as I've mentioned earlier, I wonder if him being a nice guy enabled that. In fact, he's on pretty good terms with Bill Clinton and Barack Obama despite being leaders of different parties. I wasn't even sure how that could be possible, but then again, maybe humanity's large capacity to forgive is highly centralized in the federal government. Remember that practically every world leader has at least some blood on their hands. Perhaps they understand his position and believe his reasons. Is he a war criminal? Well, his action was approved by Congress. Ewan's examples for the term don't include what he did, and I have to ask the premise for imprisonment in the first place. What would be the point? He was only dangerous in the context that given the great power of leading America, he screwed up majorly in a particular area. But other than that, how is he a threat? If you approach him, he's not going to attack you. It seems to me that putting him behind bars would only serve as petty revenge. I assert that prisons should only have one purpose: to reform the problem they pose to society that got them arrested. Only keep criminals away from society if they are actually dangerous, and perhaps rehabilitate them. But I can't think of any reason to punish someone when there is no practical benefit in doing so. In the end, I think he says it himself.
The result is an absence of checks and balances in Russia and the decision of one man to launch a wholly unjustified and brutal invasion of of Ukraine. Iraq, anyway.
One of my first thoughts includes my standard expression: if one person threatens so many people, it will always say more about the system than it will about him. A single man cannot threaten society, but only expose its weaknesses. There absolutely should have been more checks and balances within the executive branch. Some argue that we shouldn't have done anything after 9/11. Well, I argue that we shouldn't arrest him. but rather upgrade the system to not be so easily manipulated like it was back then. From a moral standpoint, with loads of research and thought, I think he is a very complicated case. He brought destruction to Iraq, but he had good reasons to believe it was justified. But he showed lots of apathy during its course. But he founded the George Bush Institute that still focuses on issues like education and veteran benefits to this day. He funded PEPFAR during the AIDS epidemic, which saved millions, and he paints portraits of soldiers who went into Afghanistan and Iraq. Also, perhaps his gaffe really was a confession. Maybe he really does feel guilty about it, but surrounds himself with positive aspects to take his mind off of it. Maybe he would confess on his deathbed. He seemed to have a certain idea that history would explain his administration for him, and maybe that's why he could never show any restraint in his policies, as he could not invade on the basis Iraq might have the weapons, but rather because they absolutely did. Would Trump have handled the situation worse in his shoes? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Though I'm sure Bush had much better intentions in his run than he did. All in all, it's very challenging to know for sure how much of the disasters that occurred during his presidency can be harshly blamed on him, as he truly was given an unfair abundance of problems to deal with. As a result, the system of evaluation is greatly convoluted, but perhaps we should be asking how any president would have handled this situation. One answer on Quora gave alternatives to the others, and many of them also would have invaded Iraq. So perhaps he says more about the entire system rather than just himself. Either to serve as this example or to be villainized for the time he found himself in, I conclude George W. Bush, an unfortunate presidency.